Prepare yourself for a journey through war and adventure. Follow Fitzroy Maclean as he takes you to the blazing deserts of North Africa. These are his words. Let's begin. David jammed on the brakes, and we slithered to a standstill. There was a heavy bar of wood across the road, with a red lantern hanging from the middle of it. On my side of the road stood a sentry who had me covered with his Tommy gun. He was an Italian. I bent down and picked up a heavy spanner from the floor of the car. Then, I beckoned to the sentry to come nearer, waving some papers at him with my free hand as if I wanted to show them to him. If only he would come near enough, I could knock him on the head, and we could drive on. He didn't move but kept me covered with his Tommy gun. Then, I saw that beyond him, in the shadows, were 2 or 3 more Italians with Tommy guns and what looked like a guardroom or a machine gun post. Unless we could bluff our way through, there would be nothing for it but to shoot it out, which was the last thing we wanted at this stage of the expedition. There was a pause, and then the sentry asked who we were. Staff officers, I told him, and added peremptorily, in a hurry. I hadn't spoken a word of Italian for 3 years, and I hoped devoutly that my accent sounded convincing. Also, that he wouldn't notice in the dark that we were all wearing British uniform. He didn't reply immediately. It looked as though his suspicions were aroused. In the car behind me, I heard a click as the safety catch of a Tommy gun slid back. Someone had decided not to take any chances. Then, just as I had made up my mind that there was going to be trouble, the sentry pointed at our headlights. "You ought to get those dimmed," he said, and, saluting sloppily, opened the gate and stood aside to let us pass. Screeching loudly, we drove on toward Benghazi. Soon we were on the outskirts of the town. Coming toward us were the headlights of another car. It passed us. Then, looking back over our shoulders, we saw that it had stopped and turned back after us. This looked suspicious. David slowed down to let it pass. The car slowed down too. He accelerated, the car accelerated. He stopped altogether, the car did the same. Then, he decided to shake it off. He put his foot down on the accelerator, and, screeching louder than ever, we drove into Benghazi at a good 80 miles per hour, with the other car chasing us. Once in the town, we turned the first corner we came to and, switching off our headlights, stopped to listen. The other car shot past and went roaring off into the darkness. For the moment, our immediate troubles were over. But only for the moment. As we sat listening, a rocket sailed up into the sky, then another, and then another. Soon, all the air raid sirens in Benghazi started to wail. We had arranged with the RAF before we started that they should leave Benghazi alone that night, so this couldn't be an air raid warning. It looked very much as though the alert was being given in our honor. We remembered the 2 South Africans, the city slicker with his Homburg hat, the suspiciously casual behavior of the sentry, and, last but not least, our pursuers in the car. It all added up to the same unpleasant conclusion: they were onto us. Clearly, the battle wagon, with its distinctive screech, was no longer an asset now that the alarm had been raised. We decided to get rid of it at once and take a chance of escaping on foot. Planting a detonator timed to go off in 30 minutes among the explosives in the back, we started off in single file through the darkness. We were in the Arab quarter of the town, which had suffered most heavily from the RAF raids. Every other house was in ruins, and, threading our way over the rubble through one bombed-out building after another, we soon put several blocks between ourselves and the place where we had left the car to explode. Once or twice we stopped to listen. We could hear people walking along the adjacent streets, but no one seemed to be following us. Then, passing through a breach in a wall, we unexpectedly emerged into a narrow side street, only to find ourselves face to face with an Italian carabiniere. There was no avoiding him, so it seemed better to take the initiative and accost him before he accosted us. The rockets and sirens provided a ready-made subject for conversation. "What," I asked, "is all this noise about?" "Oh, just another one of those damned English air raids," he said gloomily. "Might it be," I inquired anxiously, "that enemy ground forces are raiding the town and causing the alert?" Even in his depressed state, he thought this was a good joke and gave a chuckle. "No," he said, "there's no need to be nervous about that, not with the British almost back on the Egyptian frontier." I thanked him for his reassuring remarks and wished him good night. Although we had been standing under a streetlight, he didn't seem to have noticed that I was in British uniform. This encounter put a different complexion on the situation. We seemed to have been unduly pessimistic. We might still have a chance to attack the harbor and save ourselves a long walk back to the Giebel. We hurried back to the car. Our watches showed that about 25 minutes had elapsed since we had set off the time pencil. If it was an accurate one, there should still be 5 minutes to go before it detonated and blew up the car. If it was an accurate one, nervously, we extricated it from the back of the car and threw it over the nearest wall. A minute or two later, we heard it go off with a sharp crack. We hadn't been a moment too soon. The next thing was to make our way to the harbor, which was about a mile away. The screech made it inadvisable to take the car. Accordingly, we left Randolph and Corporal Rose to find somewhere to hide it, while David, Corporal Cooper, and I, with Alston as a guide, started off for the harbor, armed with Tommy guns and carrying one of the boats and a selection of explosives in a kit bag. Soon, we had left the dark alleyways of the Arab Quarter behind us and were in the European part of the town. High white buildings loomed up around us, and our footsteps echoed noisily in the broad paved streets. Then, just as we were coming to the barbed wire fence surrounding the harbor, I caught sight of a sentry. Laden as we were, we made a suspicious-looking party. Once again, I thought it better to try to set his suspicions at rest by accosting him rather than attempting to slink by unnoticed. "We've just had a motor accident," I said, thinking quickly. "All this is our luggage. Can you direct us to a hotel where we can spend the night?" The sentry listened politely. Then, he said he was afraid that all the hotels had been put out of action by the accursed English bombing, but perhaps, if we kept trying, we would find somewhere to sleep. He seemed well disposed and had apparently noticed nothing wrong with either my Italian accent or our uniforms. An unobservant man. We wished him good night and trudged off. As soon as we were out of sight, we started to look for a place to get through the wire. Eventually, we found one and dragged the boat and explosives through it. Then, dodging between cranes and railway trucks, we made our way down to the water's edge. Looking around at the dim outlines of the jetties and buildings, I realized, with a momentary feeling of satisfaction, that we were on the identical strip of shingle we had picked as a likely starting point on the wooden model at Alexandria. So far, so good. David, who has the gift of moving silently and invisibly by night, now set off on a tour of the harbor with Alston, leaving Cooper and me to inflate the boat. Crouching under a low seawall, we unpacked the kit bag and set to work with the bellows. There was no moon, but brilliant starlight. The smooth, shining surface of the harbor was like a sheet of quicksilver, and the black hulls of the ships seemed no more than a stone's throw away. They would make good targets if only we could reach them unobserved. At any rate, we wouldn't have far to paddle, though I could have wished for a better background than this smooth expanse of water. Diligently, we plugged away at the bellows, which squeaked louder than I liked, and seemed to be making little or no impression on the boat. Several minutes passed. The boat was still as flat as a pancake. We verified the connection and went on pumping. Then suddenly, we were hailed from one of the ships. It was a sentry. "Ci va là?" he challenged. "Militari," I shouted back. There was a pause, and we resumed pumping. But still the sentry was suspicious. "What are you up to over there?" he inquired. "Nothing to do with you," I answered, with a show of assurance I was far from feeling. After that, there was silence. Meanwhile, the boat remained flat. There could only be one explanation. Somehow, since we had inspected it in the wadi that morning, it had gotten punctured. There was nothing for it but to go and fetch another. It was fortunate we had to. Hiding the first boat as best we could under the shadow of the wall, we crossed the docks, slipped unseen through the hole in the wire, and walked back through the silent streets to where we had left the car. There, we found Randolph and Rose in fine spirits, trying with the utmost unconcern to maneuver the car through a hole in the wall of a bombed-out house. Occasionally, passers-by, mostly Arabs, gaped at them with undisguised interest and admiration. Wishing them luck, we pulled the second boat out of the car and started back to the harbor. Once again, we got safely through the wire and down to the water's edge, only to find that the second boat, like the first, was uninflatable. It was heartrending. Meanwhile, there was still no sign of David. We decided to go and look for him. As we reached the hole in the wire, we saw, to our disgust, someone standing on the other side of it. I was just thinking what to say in Italian when the unknown figure spoke to me in English. It was David, who had been down to the water to look for us and had been as alarmed at not finding us as we had been at not finding him. There followed a hurried council of war. All this tramping back and forth had taken time, and our watches showed we had only another half-hour of darkness. Already, the sky was beginning to lighten. We debated whether or not to plant our explosives haphazardly in the railway trucks with which the quays were crowded, but decided that, as targets, they weren't important enough to justify betraying our presence in the harbor and thus prejudicing the success of an eventual large-scale raid. If we blew them up, the alarm would be given. We would probably be able to get away in the confusion, but next time, we would stand a much poorer chance of raiding the harbor unnoticed. Our present expedition would have to be regarded as a reconnaissance. It was a hard decision to take, now that we had gotten so far. If we weren't to excite suspicion, it was essential to take away anything that would betray the fact that intruders had been in the harbor area. This meant going back to the water's edge to retrieve the boats, a nerve-wracking trip of which we were beginning to tire. This time, as I started to crawl through the hole in the wire, I suddenly found myself staring into a coal-black face with round, goggling eyes and a set of dazzling white teeth, like a minstrel show performer. It was an Ascari from Italian Somaliland. I didn't like the look of him at all. Standing over me, he grunted menacingly and pointed his bayonet at the pit of my stomach. I felt at a distinct disadvantage. David and Corporal Cooper looked on with evident interest. This seemed a more intractable problem than we had encountered before. Infusing as much irritation into my voice as I could muster, I asked this formidable blackamoor what he wanted, but he only answered, "Non parlare Italiano," and continued prodding me with his bayonet. This gave me an opening. I have always found that, when dealing with foreigners whose language you don't speak, it is best to shout. I did so now. "Non parlare Italiano?" I yelled, working myself into a fury. "Non parlare Italiano? And you a caporale?" I pointed to the stripe on his sleeve. This seemed to shake him. He lowered his bayonet and looked at me dubiously. My confidence returned. Trying to give as good a representation as I could of an angry Italian officer, I continued to shout and gesticulate. It was too much for the black man. With an expression of injured dignity, he turned and walked slowly away, leaving us to continue our progress down to the water's edge. There, we stuffed the boats and explosives back into the kit bags and started our return journey, a weary and despondent little party. It was at this stage that, looking around, I noticed there were more of us than there should be. 2 sentries with rifles and fixed bayonets had appeared from somewhere and fallen in behind us. These were a most unwelcome addition to the party. There was clearly no hope of shaking them off in the harbor area, and, with such companions, it would be fatal to try and negotiate the hole in the wire. To try and shoot it out with them would bring the whole place down on us. There was only one hope: brazen it out. Assuming as pompous a manner as my 10-day beard and shabby appearance permitted, I headed for the main gate of the docks, followed by David, Corporal Cooper, and the 2 Italian sentries. At the gate, a sentry stood on duty outside the guard tent. Walking straight up to him, I told him I wished to speak to the guard commander. To my relief, he disappeared obediently into the tent and came out a minute or 2 later, followed by a sleepy-looking sergeant, hastily pulling on his trousers. For the second time that night, I introduced myself as an officer of the General Staff, eliciting a slovenly salute. Next, I reminded him that he was responsible for the security of this part of the harbor. This, he admitted sheepishly. How was it, I asked him, that I and my party had been able to wander freely around the entire area for most of the night without once being properly challenged or asked to produce our identity cards? He had, I added, warming to my task, been guilty of a gross dereliction of duty. Why, for all he knew, we might have been British saboteurs carrying loads of high explosive. At this, he tittered incredulously, obviously thinking I was laying it on a bit thick. Well, I said, I would let him off this time, but he had better not let me catch him napping again. What was more, I added, with a nasty look at the sentry, who winced, he had better do something about smartening up his men's appearance. Then, I set off at a brisk pace through the gate, followed by David and Corporal Cooper, but not by the 2 Italians, who had shuffled off into the shadows as soon as they saw trouble brewing. My words had not been without effect. As we passed him, the sentry at the gate made a stupendous effort and presented arms, almost falling over backward in the process. By the time we got back to the car, it was nearly light, and we were relieved to find that Randolph and Corporal Rose had disposed of it in the lower part of a half-demolished house. Hurriedly, we set about camouflaging it as best we could with any old bits of planks and sacking we could find, and then looked around for somewhere to hide ourselves. There could be no question of getting back to the Gibel in daylight, and the only alternative was to lie low in Benghazi itself. On further investigation, the upper story of the house where we had hidden the car proved to be empty. It consisted of 2 rooms reached by an outside staircase in a courtyard. The shutters were down, and the whole place looked reassuringly derelict. We went inside and closed the door behind us. We might have been much worse off. There were some tins of bully beef in the car, and someone had a flask of rum. Our quarters were not luxurious, but at least there was plenty of floor space to lie down and sleep. As we were settling in, we heard a roaring, and, looking out of the window, we saw the early morning sky filled with flight after flight of German and Italian bombers coming over the city at rooftop level, doing victory rolls. They had, I supposed, just returned from the front or from a raid on Alexandria. Gradually, the town began to wake up around us. Many of the Arabs spent the night in the palm groves outside to avoid the bombing, and we couldn't be sure that someone wouldn't suddenly burst in on us. Through a hole in the wall, we watched a wizened old Arab woman next door cooking her breakfast in the courtyard. On the other side of the road, as we looked through the closed shutters, we could see a German sub-area headquarters starting its day's work, with dispatch riders dashing in and out on motorbikes and busy-looking officers arriving and leaving. Further down the street, an Arab shop was opening its shutters. From where we were, we could hear the passers-by below talking in German, Italian, and Arabic. It grew hotter. After we had eaten, we each took turns keeping watch while the others slept. We still had an uneasy feeling that our presence in the town might somehow have become known and that there might be search parties out after us. The hours passed. Then, suddenly, as we lay dozing, we heard the sound we had been half expecting all day, heavy footsteps ascending the stairs. Randolph, who was keeping watch, was outside first. There was an exclamation and a stampede. Snatching our Tommy guns, we reached the door in time to see a frightened-looking Italian sailor disappearing into the street, while Randolph, his beard bristling, stood majestically at the top of the stairs. Had the intruder been sent to spy on us, or was he simply looking for loot? Had he noticed we were in British uniform? If so, would he do anything about it? We had no way of knowing. For the next couple of hours, we sat clasping hand grenades and Tommy guns, ready to give any visitors a warm reception. But no one came. As soon as it was dark, we left our temporary home and set out for a walk around Benghazi, past the cathedral and along the seafront, keeping a sharp lookout for anything that might be of interest on our next visit. For we were determined to return under, we hoped, more auspicious conditions. We walked down the middle of the street, arms linked, whistling and doing our best to give the impression we had every right to be there. Nobody paid the slightest attention to us. On such occasions, it's your manner that counts. If you can behave naturally and avoid any appearance of furtiveness, it's worth more than any number of elaborate disguises and fake documents. Our most interesting discovery was a couple of motor torpedo boats tied up to the quayside opposite a large square building, which, from the lights blazing in all the windows and the sentries on duty at the gate, seemed to be some kind of headquarters. So interesting, in fact, that we decided it would be worth trying to blow them up on our way out of town. We accordingly went back to our temporary quarters, extricated the battle wagon, and returned with a supply of bombs. But our luck was out. As we pulled up by the side of the road opposite where the boats were moored, we saw that in our absence, a sentry had been posted there. He looked at us suspiciously. I got out of the car, and while Corporal Rose tried to get near enough to slip a bomb on one of the boats, I engaged the sentry in conversation. But it was no use. The sentry was far more interested in what Corporal Rose was doing than in what I was saying, and 2 more sentries were now watching the scene with increasing interest from the building on the other side of the road. We had missed our opportunity. Reluctantly, David called off Corporal Rose, and we got back into the car and drove off, screeching disconsolately. Our attempts at sabotage seemed doomed to failure, but we had thoroughly scouted the area and felt like old inhabitants of Benghazi by now. We would hope for better luck another time. Meanwhile, time was passing, and we wanted to be in the Gibel before first light. We made for the Benina Road. On the way out of the town, we drove for a short time in a convoy of enemy trucks. Then, we encountered the roadblock. Once again, the sentry accepted my statement that we were staff officers, and in a few minutes, we were bowling along the road toward the Gibel. We reached our rendezvous with the long-range desert group at 6 on Sunday morning, exactly 24 hours late. They had long since given us up and were having breakfast, preparing to move off. Hungrily, we threw ourselves upon mugs of tea and steaming mess tins of porridge. That concludes the third part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.